Tonight, I would very much like to tell you two things about the constant choice. They're the two questions that I always felt I wanted to ask authors discuss when they were presenting their work to various audiences. And the two questions were, why did you, author, write this book? And secondly, what did this book really mean to you, the author? So let me tell you briefly why I feel so strongly that this evil side of us needs to be fought, retarded, and eventually discarded. You know, this book is really a personal chronicle of my life's journey through evil deeds. I was born in Romania just as the Second World War was about to start. And very shortly thereafter, my father was arrested by the Nazi sympathizing regime. And we were separated, of course. My father was imprisoned in Bucharest because he was the general manager of the Ploiești oil fields in Romania. The Ploiești oil fields were the Saudi Arabia of Romania, of Europe, and the Nazi war machine, in fact, ran on the Ploiești oil fields, if you will, fuel. The critical issue for my poor father was that the Ploiești oil fields were owned by Standard Oil of New Jersey, Esso. So he got put in prison with all the political leaders who were anti-Nazis and with prisoners of war. He survived imprisonment, and in 1944 he was released from prison. We, my brother and myself, came back from Transylvania to Bucharest, where my parents lived. And we lived wonderfully a normal life, two parents, two boys, and it was glorious. And then in early January 1947, my father took a trip to New York to visit his colleagues at Standard Oil headquarters at 30 Rockefeller Plaza. And just at that moment, retrospectively, I say fortuitously, the Iron Curtain came down. And that was an apt name, because not only did the Iron Curtain separate Eastern Europe from Western Europe, it really connoted the reality that nobody could get into the Eastern European nations without the approval of the communist regimes. And that was, in fact, reality. So not only that, but had my father tried to return to Romania at that time, he would have been killed. And the evidence for that is the simple fact that the communist regime in Romania in those early years rounded up some 250 to 300,000 people, political leaders, business leaders, religious leaders, anybody who would be against, or they thought they could be against the communist regime, was rounded up and killed. No gas chambers. They learned from the Nazis. No, they wouldn't do that. They just send them to work, to build canals that never connected anything, and to bridges to nowhere, as we know so well here. So in a couple of years, underfed, facing terrible climatic conditions, Romania gets really cold in the winter, underdressed. In 2 or 3 years, these people died. But we felt secure and comfortable, because we left Bucharest to go with my grandfather to Transylvania. The reason we felt safe is because my grandfather, now almost 80 years old, was a very special man in Romania. He was beloved in his Transylvania homeland. You see, he negotiated at the end of the First World War the enlargement of Romania to the size where it is now, about 30% larger than it used to be. And not only that, he was loved by the people because he had helped the peasants and the citizens of Transylvania lift their standard of living dramatically while he was a governor of the region. So this wonderful man, and he was a giant of a guy, 6'5", and I remember walking down the street with him, holding his hand. And in those days, when a man walked out of his home, he always had to wear a fedora hat. And I remember men sort of tipping their hats off to my grandfather, and women bowing their heads. He was adored. He was loved. And yet, a few months later, some of the same people jumped over the fence in the middle of the night, now dressed in boots of the secret police, and took my grandfather away. And I still remember his face, the look in his eye, stern yet composed, with a touch of melancholy, in a sense communicating that, I'll likely never see these two boys again, nor my wife. And that was the case. Last year, my wife Barbara, our son Andrew, and our 3 granddaughters went to Romania, and we went to visit the prison where my grandfather spent the last few days of his life. And, it was a poignant moment, to say the least. But we were told that what had happened to him is that the routine of being incarcerated in shackles included the fact that you had to scrub the floor of your cell every day. By the way, they're also given only 500 calories a day of food. So all of the prisoners in that area were dead within 2 or 3 years. But my grandfather didn't die that way. Apparently, when cleaning his cell one day, a prison guard came in and started to kick him in the face until he died. So that was my grandfather's story. And a few months later, it was my turn. I was arrested together with my brother and my grandmother and sent to hard labor. Now, as I reflect on that period of my life, these scenes are kind of etched in my brain as if I've just seen a movie a few weeks ago. I see our new home. It was really one room that was taken by the secret police from some locals' home in the town of Botoshan, close to the Russian eastern border. And the room was occupied about a third by our bed. Our bed was a bunch of hay and a few blankets. And me, I remember myself as a skinny little guy, dressed in gray tunics, resembling, prison garb, headed to work, almost always in the dark, because I had to go to work before 6 o'clock in the morning. A 10 to 12-hour day would follow. At first, this little boy had to go down in the bowels of the city sewers, where winter and summer, it was always cold and damp. And of course, that stench kind of lived in my sinuses for months on end, even after I stopped working in the sewers. And I can still sense, this little boy bent over almost at right angles, carrying buckets full of sludge to the openings that were created by the underground sewers. Now, as I graduated to work above ground, and when I got bigger, I dug holes for electric poles in the countryside, in Botoshan. And later in the early mornings, about 5 o'clock or so, my task was to turn off the lights in part of the city. Now, there were a bunch of transformers on my beat. And you could sense these green painted monsters as you approach them, by the humming sound that they emitted and the smell that was akin to burnt rubber. The lights were almost always dim because they didn't have many lampposts. They were maybe 150, 200 yards apart. Now, while from the outside the transformer looked the same, inside the transformer, they all were a little different. And what was different is where the light switches were placed. And that was a very important thing to remember, because the switch had a handle made of about 3 to 4 inches long, made out of wood, the handle was. And if you didn't grab the wooden handle and you touched the metal, your 300 volts that will come through you, and often enough, you get slammed to the ground. Meanwhile, in New York, my parents were to face an extraordinary Hobson's choice. The Council to the United Nations from Romania came to my father and said very simply, Mr. Georgescu, if you want to see your kids alive again, you have to spy for us. For us being the Romanians and the Russians against the United States. Now by then, my father and mother had become American citizens. And, you know, he knew very well, and so did my mother, that they could never return back to communist Romania. And so what were these poor parents going to do? And I will confess that I have never, in an emotional sense, ever put myself in my parents' shoes to try to figure out how would I respond as a parent if somebody confronted me with that reality. And so what my parents did, the following morning, they went to the FBI and said, this is what happened to us. What should we do? And the FBI said, Mr. Georgescu, we'd like you to become a double agent. And my father said, I don't think so. I've seen this movie before. It never ends well. Because sooner or later, I won't be able to do what they're telling me to do, or I won't want to do what they're telling me to do, and they'll kill the kids anyway. What else might I do? So after some reflection, they said, okay, Mr. Georgescu, you're an American citizen. Go to the press and tell the press that you, an American citizen, are being blackmailed by the Soviet Union with the lives of your children. And the point is that we can create such a scandal that the Russians would not allow the Romanians to kill the boys, because the Russians and the Soviet Union would want to be perceived by the world as a civilized nation, as advanced country. The evil empire was yet to come. And so my parents decided to do this. So they chose on principle, they chose on integrity, they chose on honesty, and they put their fate and our lives in the hands of the people of the world and their own personal belief in God. And they were not to be disappointed with their choice. Because one of the persons who read about this story in the press, and there was press in every little town in America, they talked about the blackmail Georgescu boys in Romania. And this particular person who read the story called my father and said, Mr. Georgescu, I'll get the boys out for you. And she was Frances Payne Bolton. She was a congresswoman, a Republican congresswoman, head of the Foreign Relations Committee in Congress. And she was committed to take the boys, to bring us, the boys, out of Romania. And, you know, she was a formidable woman. I had the good fortune to get to know her quite well afterwards. And this woman had gravitas. She was one of the wealthiest women in the world in her day. And at the age of 50, she took over her husband's seat in Congress, and she lost her last election at the age of 86 by only a couple thousand votes in Ohio. And as she would walk, if she would walk in this room, you would all feel this woman could part the seas. She was one of those extraordinary, unique people. And so she went to work. She went to the Russians and said, let the boys go. She went to the Romanians and said the same thing. The Romanians said, no, it's the Russians. The Russians said the Romanian. So shortly thereafter, she said, enough of this. She went to Eisenhower and said, Mr. President, get the boys out. We don't know what the president said. He probably said, yes, ma'am, and saluted. Because what happened was that we got traded for a bunch of Russian spies. We don't know their names. We don't know how many. Because they didn't keep records in those days of these kinds of actions. But the only thing we know for sure is that my brother and I landed at Idlewild Airport, Kennedy now, on April 13th, 1954. So back in freedom, and having endured what we did, that was not quite the end of it, was it? Because in my lifespan, and many of yours as well, except to some of the younger folks in this room, we witnessed some other extraordinary capital E evil happenings. The Russian Gulag under Stalin that killed 30 million Russian people. And of course the Holocaust and Pol Pot's killing fields and Darfur and Rwanda. And now in virtual time, what's happening in Syria. And interestingly, what is less talked about is what has happened just south of the border in Mexico. And not just these kind of cataclysmic events, but here in our own backyard, much subtler kind of evil that harms people continues. And I do define evil as acts that really harm other people. By the way, that's the definition of my iPhone. That's what the iPhone says evil is. And I add to that acts that harm other people without fair and reasonable justification. So let me give you just a couple of examples. You can go back to the 2008 causes for the fiscal recession that happened, where millions upon millions of people lost their job, and they're still suffering this very day. And we talked about the distortion and deceptions that happen in our political campaigns. And you can say, well, that's just in Washington. But the Beltway doesn't insulate what happens in the rest of the country. Importantly, because they are role models. These are our leaders. And it cascades, what they do cascades down, importantly, to the youth. And last year, just before Christmas, a young student from Stuyvesant High, and Stuyvesant High in this town is arguably one of the finest high schools, not only in New York, but probably in the country. And this student who was going to go to an Ivy League school said, over 80% of my classmates cheat. And just a couple of weeks later, in the New York Post, there was a story about 120 plus kids at Harvard were caught in some kind of a cheating scandal. And this is not about Harvard or Stuyvesant Town. This goes on across America. That's the sad part. This is ubiquitous. And it's not just the kids that are trying desperately to get into college, so they have to cheat to make it, or to get a job from college to get a good job. No. Research is showing that the very best, the very smartest kids in school cheat simply because they can. So the point is, what are these kids learning? What will happen when these kids become the next leaders in politics and in business? When the choice is between principle and profiting from taking shortcuts from a bit of corruption. I worry about that, And there's a lot of other things that are happening, the bullying in the schoolyards and in business, and harassment and bigotry and discrimination that is happening too often in our society. And why does our society promote such horrific violence in movies, in television, in video games? It's obviously dehumanizing our condition, and they're obviously also a contributor to the kind of horrible stuff that's happening not only in Newtown, in Virginia Tech, and in thousands upon thousands of violent deaths, of over 30,000 a year in small towns and big towns around the country. So you can perhaps sense why I have been obsessed with trying to understand why do we do this to one another? Where's this source of our capacity that seems so unnatural to most of us most of the time? So in the book, I hypothesize, and I offer a detailed description using my personal experiences, using studies I have made in this area, and enormous amount of discussions that I've had with evolutionary biologists. And I contend that the source of this evil is happening because our instincts started to have learned this behavior, started maybe some 7 million, underlined 7 million years ago, when some catastrophic event, geological event, forced our predecessor to come down from the tree onto the ground and live in the African plains, where they had to meet the most aggressive predators that have ever lived on this earth. So they had to learn to be ruthless and violent and deceptive to survive. And they had to endure extraordinary climate changes of ice age quality and amazing heat where there was no food. So they started to learn to hoard, to get to more, the better. And greed started. And it was useful because it helped them survive. And if tribes didn't have enough of the food they needed, they would go and find it somewhere else. If the other people wouldn't give them enough food, they would kill them. And that's what it took to survive. So now when I think about humanity's original sin, I don't think about Eve taking a bite out of the apple. I think about these poor creatures and what it took for them to survive their times in the African plains. So I'm not trying to depress us tonight at all. I think it's important for us to understand, most likely, where this evil likely comes from. But we also need to understand that we are not only that, we're also better than that, aren't we? We're also caring, compassionate, and loving people. I see it here tonight. I see it in our families. I saw it in my business world. And I saw it, and I think we all saw it in the aftermath of Sandy, didn't we? When thousands upon thousands of people in this city reached out to the folks on the coastlines in New Jersey and New York and Connecticut, and we sent them clothing because it was cold those days, as we remember. And we sent them food because there was none. And hundreds of people took people in because they didn't have a home anymore. And I go to work at New York Presbyterian Hospital, just some blocks away, and there are thousands of people who choose to live to work with caring, loving, and compassion to heal people. And you know, just a couple of days ago, we had another event, and we witnessed what happened in Boston, where thousands upon thousands of people rushed to the nearby hospitals to donate blood to help the 100 or 200 people who were hurt in that evil massacre at the Boston Marathon. You know, those evil instincts have no place in our family life. They have no place in our community life. They have no place in our nation or even in the interconnected global village. And perhaps it is time for us to publicly go out and decry and say, enough with this kind of business. We can choose to live on the good side of our natures. You know, our instincts don't decide for us. We choose. We get to choose whether we want to be happy or not. And I remember a very emotional interview with the actor Michael J. Fox, who said, you know, I've got Parkinson. Everything else I get to choose. And I like Google's claim to saying, do no evil. You know, we can choose the amazing, beautiful, kind, compassionate side of our natures. It is here, it is real in all of our lives. Now, I have experienced receiving acts of kindness and compassion and thoughtfulness all my life. You know, I've been blessed with a long list of guardian angels who have reached out and helped me at so many difficult points in my life. And they were family, they were friends, but they were also perfect strangers who reached out to help me simply because they could. And I would bet you that almost every single one of you sitting in this room tonight have the same kind of experience, where people have reached out to help you become the wonderful people whom you have become, the wonderful people that you are. You know, we have been shown how to live our lives by great inspirational leaders all through history. You can go back to Confucius and Buddha, you can go to Muhammad, and you can go to Moses, you can go to Jesus, my personal hero, the way he lived his life, his words, his deeds. And even in modern times, let's go back to Lincoln and, to Mother Teresa and to Gandhi and Martin Luther King and Mandela and thousands of others who have helped us illuminate and sort of express the enlightenment of what the human condition could be. So, just a couple more points about what I've learned along my life's journey. First, a wise man said, it's never what happens to you that defines who you are. It's the choices that you make in response to what happens to you that defines your character and who you are as a person. And as for me, my mission has become clear. I try to get up every morning and say, okay, I'm going to try my best to live life on that good side of the human nature. And at night, I take stock, and I got to tell you, I fell a lot. And I try to understand, why didn't I not just do the big things, but why didn't I try to put a smile on somebody's face who needed a little bit of a boost, or lifted somebody's burden because I could and didn't. And I promised myself that the next morning I'll get up and try harder, and the morning after that, and the morning after that. And the third thing I wanted to tell you that I've learned is some really good news, fantastic news. It's a new science, it's called epigenetics. And this science says that humans, if they behave consistently in a certain pattern, they can change who they are. For example, if you are a good person, behave like a good person over time, you not only become a better person spiritually or intellectually, you in fact physiologically become a better person. And that happens because there are these little molecules that sit on top of your DNA that observe how you behave. And they give instructions around those instincts that we talked about to reinforce the behavior, the good behavior that you've demonstrated. Now that's great news. And the better news is that we are capable of passing these wonderful little molecules to our children and their children. Now that's extraordinary news. It's just happening right now. This is a science discovered just within less than a decade. We'll hear lots more about this. So now, again, we have choices to make. But along with every discovery comes a sense of responsibility. Because we no longer can claim, oh, we can't change, or oh, we can't control this evil side of our natures. Now we can choose our path. Now we can choose our future. And now we must understand that the only reality that matters is the reality that we can create for ourselves. And finally, from everything I've learned, I'm convinced that for humanity to reach the promise of the wonderful city on the hill in all its glory, it can only come through us. We are the vessel. We are the vehicle to achieve this enlightenment. We have to do it through our actions. We have to do it through our choices. So it's up to you and me. There's a heck of a job left to be done by all of us. So when I look at us, as some of us with graying hair, I say our job's not done. We have a lot to do, a lot of work to do. Because while it may take generations after generations and thousands of years to get all the way to the promised land, I know that tomorrow morning, it's up to you and me. And I want to close with a wonderful little story. It's my favorite story about an 8-year-old boy. He's an Indian child who goes to see his grandfather, the chieftain. And the little boy says, Grandpa, I need your help, Grandpa. I'm scared. I'm really, really, really scared. They told me that up in the sky out there, there's a big battle going on between the bad wolf, this nasty, mean, aggressive wolf. He hates kids, Grandpa. He hates kids. And on the other side is the good wolf, kind and gentle and generous. You can't even pet this wolf. It's wonderful. And they fight and fight and fight. And Grandpa, I'm worried. I don't know. They won't tell me which wolf is going to win. I'm scared, Grandpa. Please tell me. So the old man looks at his grandson and says, son, the one you're going to feed. The one you're going to feed. Thank you very much.